Hey guys, tonight we begin with the vast and brutal world of the Silk Road. The ancient trade network that connected east and west, carried silk, gold, and spices, and quietly eliminated anyone who thought it would be a fun travel experience. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up before sunrise, not because you're disciplined, not because you're chasing productivity, and definitely not because you're excited for the day ahead. You wake up because your body has filed an official complaint against the ground you slept on. And it lost. Your bed is a thin, tired blanket spread over terrain that feels like it was personally designed to ruin spines. You try to move, and your back immediately reminds you that you are no longer the main character. You are now a background extra in your own suffering. Your mouth is dry. Not, I could use some water dry. More like, you could store pottery in here dry. You haven't even stood up yet, and you already miss your old life, and your old bed, and honestly, your old problems. Welcome to your first morning on the Silk Road. You sit up slowly, blinking into the early light, hoping for a peaceful sunrise moment. You do not get one. What you get instead is chaos. Camels groaning like they're underpaid, merchants shouting in languages you don't understand, and the constant noise of people who have accepted this lifestyle in a way that feels deeply concerning. You look around, trying to figure out what's going on, and that's when it hits you. You don't understand anyone, not a single word. For all you know, someone could be giving you vital instructions, or asking why you're still sitting there like a decorative object. You nod anyway, confidently, like someone who absolutely belongs here. You do not. Breakfast appears. If you lower your expectations enough, it technically qualifies. A piece of bread is handed to you, dense, dry, and capable of defending itself if attacked. You bite into it and immediately realize this is less meal and more test of commitment. Then comes the dried meat. You stare at it briefly, trying to determine its origin, its age, and whether it has already been eaten once before. You decide not to ask questions. Questions are for people with options. And then, water. You take a sip. It's warm, slightly bitter, possibly alive. You pause for a second. Then you drink more. Because here's the thing. Out here, your standards are not important. Survival is. Around you, the caravan is already packing up. No one is waiting for you to stretch, hydrate properly, or emotionally process your situation. The road doesn't care if you're ready. You look down at your hands, stiff and unfamiliar, and then a quiet realization settles in. This isn't the hardest part of your day. This is the warm-up, and you are already losing. You don't get a moment to recover. There's no gentle transition. No, take your time. No encouraging speech about teamwork and perseverance. The caravan starts moving, and if you're not already on your feet, you're immediately a problem. So you stand up, still half functional, and begin walking. At first, it doesn't seem so bad. It's just walking, right? You've done this before. You've walked to places. You've even enjoyed it. That confidence lasts about 12 minutes. The ground is uneven, dry, and somehow manages to hurt your feet through your shoes. Sand begins to slip inside, settling in like it pays rent. You try to ignore it, but it's everywhere now. Between your toes, in your clothes, probably in your future memories. The pace doesn't slow. That's when you realize something important. This is not a casual journey. This is a moving system, and you are a very replaceable part of it. The experienced traders don't complain. They don't stop. They move with a rhythm that suggests they've accepted this as their personality now. Meanwhile, you're already calculating how far you've gone, and how far you still have to go. Mistake. Never think about the distance. That's how hope dies. The sun begins to rise, slowly at first, like it's pretending to be harmless. You almost appreciate it. A bit of warmth, a bit of light, then it keeps rising, and rising, and suddenly it's no longer your friend. You feel the heat building, pressing down on you like an unwanted responsibility. Your clothes stick to your skin, your breathing gets heavier. Every step starts to feel slightly more expensive. You glance around, hoping for some kind of landmark, something to break the monotony. Nothing, just endless terrain stretching in every direction. Like the world has decided to repeat the same background texture indefinitely. At some point, your thoughts start to change. You're no longer thinking about the Silk Road or trade or history. You're thinking about sitting down, just for a second, but then you notice something. No one else is stopping, not one person. Because everyone here understands the rule you're just beginning to learn. If you stop, you might not start again. So you keep walking, not because you want to, but because the alternative is significantly worse. And somehow, incredibly, this is still only the beginning of your day. At some point, the sun stops pretending. It's no longer rising gently in the sky like a peaceful background element. It's now directly above you, fully committed to your destruction, radiating heat with the confidence of something that has never once been challenged. You feel it immediately, not just on your skin, but everywhere. Your clothes trap the heat. Your head feels heavy. Even the air itself feels thick, like you're breathing through something you weren't meant to breathe through. You try to take a deeper breath. Bad decision. It's hot, dry, unhelpful. You glance around, hoping for shade. There is none. No trees, no shelters, not even a rock big enough to pretend it could help you. Just open space and the quiet realization that you are completely exposed to the elements. And the elements are not in a good mood today. Your pace slows slightly, not by choice. Your body just decides that this is the speed now. Your legs feel heavier, your steps less stable. You can feel your energy slipping away in small, quiet increments. And then there's the sweating. At first, it feels like a good thing. Your body trying to cool you down. But after a while, it becomes a problem, because every drop of sweat is water leaving your body. And water, as you're quickly learning, is more valuable than anything you're carrying. You wipe your forehead. It doesn't help. You look at your water supply. It looks back at you, silently judging your future decisions. Do you drink now, or wait? You hesitate. That hesitation is new. Back home, you drank water without thinking. You had preferences. Cold water, maybe with ice, maybe flavored. Here, you're negotiating with yourself over survival. You take a small sip. It's warm. Of course it is. Nothing here is refreshing. Even the idea of refreshment feels unrealistic now. Around you, the caravan keeps moving. No one stops. No one complains. Or maybe they do, just not in a language you understand. You watch them, trying to copy their rhythm, their posture, their calm. But there's something they have that you don't. Experience. They know how to move, how to conserve energy, how to endure. You, on the other hand, are discovering all of this in real time. Poorly. The sun presses down harder. The ground reflects heat back up. You are now being cooked from multiple angles, like a very unfortunate historical example. And that's when it hits you. This isn't just uncomfortable. This is dangerous. And the day isn't even halfway over. Eventually the sun starts to drop. You notice it slowly at first. The light softens. The shadows stretch. And for a brief, beautiful moment, you think things are getting better. You were wrong. The heat fades, but it doesn't leave behind comfort. It leaves behind emptiness, and that emptiness fills quickly with something worse. Cold, not a gentle, refreshing chill. Not the kind that makes you reach for a cozy blanket and feel poetic about life. This is sharp, immediate, and deeply personal. The temperature drops so fast it feels like the world just changed its mind about you. One moment you're overheating, the next you're wondering if your fingers still work. You pull your thin blanket tighter around yourself. It does absolutely nothing. It's less of a blanket and more of a suggestion. The ground, which was baking you alive just hours ago, is now cold and unforgiving. You lie down anyway, because exhaustion has officially defeated dignity. Around you, the caravan settles for the night. Fires flicker here and there, small clusters of warmth in an otherwise indifferent landscape. People speak in low voices, eat what little they have, and prepare to do this all over again tomorrow. Like this is normal behavior. You try to relax. You really do. But your body has other plans. Your muscles are sore. Your feet hurt in ways that feel creative. And now, on top of everything, you're shivering. You curl into yourself, trying to conserve heat, trying to trick your body into thinking this is manageable. It isn't. And then there are the sounds. During the day, the world was loud. Movement, voices, chaos. At night, it's quiet. Too quiet. Every small noise stands out. A distant rustle, a shifting shadow, the low, unsettling sound of something moving just outside your line of sight. You stare into the darkness, suddenly very aware that you are not at the top of the food chain here. Not even close. Sleep becomes a negotiation. You drift off for a few minutes, then wake up. Adjust. Shiver. Repeat. Time moves slowly, painfully slowly. At some point, you stop trying to sleep and just wait for morning, because at least the sun, despite its issues, is predictable. And as you lie there, cold, tired, and wide awake, one thought quietly settles in your mind. You were worried about the heat. You didn't realize the Silk Road works in shifts. Morning arrives again, not because you slept well, but because your body has officially given up on expecting comfort. You sit up slowly, feeling every single step from yesterday still living rent-free in your muscles. For a brief moment, you consider staying where you are, just lying back down, ignoring everything. Then you notice something. The caravan is already moving. No announcement, no warning. No good morning, let's begin our journey together. They're just leaving. And suddenly, you understand something very important. You are not in control of anything here. You scramble to your feet, grabbing your belongings in a way that suggests both urgency and mild panic. No one helps you. No one waits. You are expected to keep up, not be accommodated. You manage to rejoin the group, slightly out of breath, slightly embarrassed, and very aware that you almost got left behind on your second day. Not a strong start. As you fall into pace, you start observing more closely. The caravan moves with structure. There's an order to things. Experienced traders at the front, guards watching the sides, animals loaded with goods in careful arrangements. Everyone has a role, except you. You are there, not essential, not particularly useful. Just present, hoping that continues to be enough. Decisions are made without you. Routes are chosen, stops are determined, risks are evaluated, all by people who know what they're doing. You, on the other hand, are still trying to figure out how to walk efficiently without thinking about quitting every 20 minutes. You begin to understand the hierarchy. At the top, experienced merchants, wealthy traders, and those who actually own the goods. Below them, guards, guides, and people who know the land. Further down, laborers, handlers, and those doing the physical work. And somewhere near the bottom, you. Right next to person who will absolutely not be missed if things go wrong. You don't like that realization, but you respect it. Because out here, usefulness is survival. If you slow down, you're a liability. If you get injured, you're a problem. If you can't keep up, you're left behind. No dramatic farewell, no heroic moment. Just the quiet understanding that the caravan moves forward. With or without you. You keep walking, more alert now, more aware of your place. And for the first time since this journey began, you stop thinking of yourself as a traveller. You start thinking like cargo, which, surprisingly, is a more accurate description of your situation. By now you've accepted a few things. You're tired. You're uncomfortable. You are, in every possible sense, out of your depth. But there's one problem that keeps quietly getting worse. You still don't understand anyone. At first it was just inconvenient, a bit awkward. You nod, you gesture, you pretend you know what's happening. Now, it's becoming dangerous. Someone approaches you, speaking quickly, pointing at a bundle near your feet. Their tone sounds urgent, maybe even annoyed. You freeze. This could be important. Instructions maybe, a warning, a request, or you could be getting blamed for something you didn't do. You respond the only way you can, a confident nod, paired with a vague hand gesture that means absolutely nothing. They stare at you, you stare back. For a moment you both exist in complete confusion. Then they sigh, walk past you and grab the bundle themselves. Great. You may have just refused to help someone, or agreed to something, or insulted them. It's hard to tell, and that's the problem. Every interaction feels like a gamble with unclear stakes. You start noticing how others communicate. Short phrases, quick gestures, familiar routines. There's a rhythm to it, one you are not part of. You try to copy it, poorly. You point at things. You nod too much. At one point, you smile during what appears to be a serious conversation, which immediately lowers your credibility to zero. People begin to avoid you, not out of hostility, but out of practicality. It's easier to deal with someone who understands what's going on. You are, at this point, conversationally expensive. And then comes the real issue. Warnings. You notice someone shouting, pointing toward the distance. Others react quickly, adjusting their positions, tightening their grip on their belongings, moving with purpose. You don't move. Not because you're brave, because you have no idea what's happening. A guard passes by, gestures sharply for you to stay close. You obey, instantly aware that you've just missed something important. Something that everyone else understood, except you. And that's when it fully sinks in. Out here, language isn't just about conversation. It's about survival. It tells you when to move, when to stop, when to be alert, and when something is wrong. Without it, you're always a step behind, always reacting late, always guessing. You keep walking, quieter now, more observant, trying to pick up patterns, tones, anything that might help, because the truth is becoming very clear. On the Silk Road, not understanding people doesn't just make you look lost, it makes you vulnerable. At some point, your priorities change. Not gradually, not thoughtfully, just instantly. You stop thinking about the journey, the destination, the history, the experience. All of that disappears, replaced by one single overwhelming concern: water. You check your supply again, then again, and then, just to be sure, one more time, as if looking at it repeatedly might somehow increase the amount. It doesn't. The container feels lighter than it should, or maybe that's just your growing anxiety pretending to be physics. You take a small sip, not because you're extremely thirsty, although you are, but because you're trying to manage it, control it, stretch it. You hold the water in your mouth for a second, like it's something precious, which out here it is. Back home, water was effortless. You drank it without thinking. You wasted it without noticing. You even had preferences. Cold, filtered, sparkling. You had options. Out here, you have survival. And survival doesn't come with options. You start watching others more closely. How often they drink, how much, when. You notice something interesting. They're careful, very careful. No one drinks casually. No one takes large gulps. Every sip is measured, controlled, deliberate. Like they've all agreed that water is no longer a basic need. It's currency. You feel your throat tightening again, dry and uncomfortable. You want to drink more? You really do. But you hesitate, because you don't know when you'll get more. And that uncertainty is worse than the thirst itself. The sun climbs higher, pressing down with the same relentless energy as before. Your body sweats, and every drop feels like a loss you can't afford. You wipe your forehead. Congratulations. You've just wasted resources. You start to feel it now. The subtle signs, slight dizziness, slower reactions, a growing sense that your body is running on less than it needs. Nothing dramatic, not yet, but enough to remind you that this isn't sustainable. Someone nearby adjusts their water container, holding it close, almost protectively. You understand that instinct now. Out here, water isn't just important, it's everything. You look ahead, hoping for some sign. A stop, a well, anything. There's nothing. Just more road, more heat, more time between you and the next drink. And that's when it really hits you. Gold can wait, silk can wait, everything can wait. But water? Water decides if you continue, or if you don't. Eventually, something changes. The endless walking slows. The caravan begins to cluster together, voices rising slightly, movements becoming less mechanical. You look ahead, and for the first time in what feels like forever, you see something that resembles civilization. A caravanserai. Calling it an inn is generous. Calling it a relief is accurate. Thick walls, a central courtyard, few shaded areas, and most importantly, water. Real water. Not imaginary, not hypothetical. Actual water you can see, which immediately makes it the most beautiful thing you've encountered on this journey. You step inside with the rest of the group, trying not to look too desperate. It doesn't work. You drink carefully at first, pretending you have discipline, then slightly less carefully. Then you remember Chapter 7 and force yourself to stop before you make a decision your future self will regret. Progress. Food is available too. Still basic, still underwhelming, but at this point, anything that isn't trying to actively end your existence counts as a positive experience. You sit down, finally off your feet, and for a brief moment, things feel almost normal. Almost. Because as the sun sets and the courtyard shifts into evening mode, you start noticing something. Different groups forming, quiet conversations, subtle exchanges, parts of the Caravanserai that seem busier than others. Travel along the Silk Road isn't just about goods, it's about people. And when you gather tired, lonely travelers who have money and uncertain futures, certain patterns tend to repeat themselves. You don't need a guide to understand what's happening. Some individuals move through the space with purpose, offering companionship, conversation, distraction from the journey. It's not loud, not advertised, just quietly understood. You watch from a distance, not out of judgment, but out of curiosity and mild confusion. Because let's be honest, you haven't had a proper meal, a proper bath, or a proper night of sleep in days. Romance feels ambitious. You look down at yourself, dust-covered, exhausted, and operating on minimal resources. Yes, this is definitely your peak condition. You consider your options for about 5 seconds. Then you remember your water supply, your energy level, and the general state of your existence. You make the only logical decision available to you. You stay exactly where you are, because out here priorities are simple. Water, food, rest. Everything else is optional, and right now you're barely keeping up with the essentials. The brief comfort of the Caravanserai doesn't last. You leave rested, technically, fed, in the loosest possible sense, hydrated, cautiously. And for a short moment, you almost feel like you're getting used to this. That feeling disappears the moment you're back on the road, because now your body expects food, and the Silk Road does not care about expectations. Hunger creeps in slowly at first, a quiet reminder, a suggestion, something you think you can manage. Then it grows, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to sit in the background of everything you do. Every step, every thought, every moment becomes slightly more difficult. You reach for your food supply. Bread again. Of course it's bread. You break off a piece, and it resists slightly, as if it's not entirely convinced this is its purpose. You bite into it anyway. It's dry, dense, and determined to remove any remaining moisture from your mouth. Efficient in its own way. The dried meat follows. You chew slowly, partly because it's tough, partly because you're trying to convince your brain that this is satisfying. It isn't, but it's enough, and that's the theme you're starting to notice. Everything here is enough. Enough water to keep going, enough food to stay functional, enough rest to stand up again tomorrow, nothing more. You look around at the others. No one is complaining. No one is searching for variety or flavor or comfort. They eat quickly, efficiently, and move on. Food here is not an experience, it's maintenance. You try to match their pace, but your mind keeps drifting. You think about real meals, warm meals, meals that didn't require negotiation or strategy. You immediately regret that thought, because now you're not just hungry, you're nostalgic. And nostalgia is not helpful when you're trying to survive. The road stretches ahead, unchanged and unimpressed by your situation. You take another bite, slower this time, forcing yourself to focus. Calories, energy, movement. That's all this is. You swallow, take a small sip of water to help push everything down and continue walking. Because stopping to enjoy your food isn't an option. And honestly, there's not much to enjoy anyway. At this point, you're not eating because you want to. You're eating because if you don't, you won't make it much further. You've heard the stories. Everyone has. Bandits hiding along the Silk Road, waiting for the right moment, striking caravans, disappearing into the landscape like they were never there. At first, it sounded exaggerated. One of those things people say to make a journey feel more dramatic. It's not. You realize that the moment the atmosphere changes, there's no announcement, no explanation, just a shift. Conversations become shorter, quieter. The usual noise of the caravan softens, replaced by something tighter, more focused. You notice the guards first. They're more alert now. Their posture changes, their eyes scanning the horizon more frequently. Hands rest closer to weapons. Movements are sharper, more deliberate. That alone is enough to tell you everything you need to know. Something is off. You look around, trying to spot what they see. At first, nothing stands out. Just the same endless terrain, the same repeating landscape you've been staring at for days. Then you notice it, a shape in the distance, maybe more than one. Too still to be travelers, too placed to be random. Your brain tries to rationalize it. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just rocks, shadows, your imagination trying to keep things interesting. But the tension around you says otherwise. The caravan tightens formation. People move closer together. The animals are kept under stricter control. You instinctively do the same. Stay close. Stay quiet. Don't draw attention. It feels strange. This silent agreement between people who barely communicate, suddenly moving as one, and then it hits you. If something happens, you're not prepared. You don't know how to fight. You don't know the plan. You don't even know where you're supposed to stand if things go wrong. You are, once again, the least useful person in the situation. The shapes in the distance don't move closer. They don't need to. Just being there is enough. A reminder. The Silk Road is not just a path of trade. It's a path of opportunity. And not all of that opportunity belongs to merchants. After what feels like far too long, the caravan continues forward, slowly, carefully. The shapes remain where they are, watching, calculating, or maybe just deciding you're not worth the effort today. Either way, you don't feel relieved. You feel aware, because now you understand something you didn't fully believe before. The danger here isn't theoretical, it's constant. And sometimes, it's just waiting for the right moment. It starts quietly. A cough. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just a small, ordinary sound that barely stands out against the usual noise of the caravan. You ignore it. Everyone does. Because out here, small problems are easier to pretend don't exist. Then you hear it again, from someone else this time. And then again, within a day, it's no longer just background noise. It's everywhere. Short coughs, tired breaths, the subtle signs of people not feeling quite right. You start paying attention. One of the traders is moving slower than before. Another keeps wiping their face, looking slightly unsteady. Someone else hasn't spoken in hours, just walking with their head down, conserving whatever energy they have left. It spreads fast, not in a dramatic, sudden way, but steadily, like everything else on this journey. Close quarters, shared water sources, constant exhaustion. It's the perfect environment for something to move through a group without resistance, and there is no real solution. No medicine, no proper treatment. No one stepping in with a plan, just continuation. You begin to feel it too. Not illness exactly, not yet, but something close. A heaviness, a slight weakness in your limbs, the kind of feeling that tells you your body is not entirely on your side anymore. You try to ignore it. You walk a little straighter, breathe a little deeper, convince yourself it's just fatigue, because admitting anything else would mean acknowledging a very uncomfortable truth. If you get sick out here, you become a problem, and problems don't last long on the Silk Road. You watch as one of the men stumbles slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to draw attention. A few people glance over, then look away just as quickly. No one stops. No one offers help. Not because they're cruel, because they can't afford to be. The caravan keeps moving. It always does. And now you understand why. Stopping for one person risks slowing everyone down. Slowing down risks exposure. Exposure risks everything. So the system continues, regardless of who keeps up and who doesn't. You swallow, suddenly very aware of your own condition. You check your pace, your breathing, your strength, still moving, still functional for now. But the margin feels thinner, and for the first time since this journey began, you realize something deeply unsettling. It's not just the environment you have to survive, it's your own body. And right now, it's not looking entirely reliable. Just when you think you've figured it out, the road changes, not gradually, not politely, just suddenly. The flat, endless desert that's been draining your soul for days begins to break apart. The ground hardens, sand gives way to rock. The horizon shifts, and in the distance, you start to see something you were not emotionally prepared for. Mountains. At first, they look manageable, almost distant, decorative even, like a background detail that doesn't concern you. Then the caravan starts heading toward them. Of course it does. You feel a brief moment of denial. Maybe you'll go around. Maybe there's a path that avoids the steep parts, the difficult climbs, the obvious suffering. There isn't. Soon enough, you're walking uphill, and everything gets worse. Your legs, already tired from days of walking, now have to deal with elevation. Each step requires more effort. Your breathing becomes heavier, faster. The air feels thinner, less cooperative. You didn't think breathing could get more difficult. It can. The ground is uneven, unpredictable. Loose stones shift under your feet. You have to watch every step, carefully placing your weight like you're learning how to walk all over again. You almost missed the sand. Almost. The caravan slows slightly, but not enough to help you. The experienced travelers adjust easily, finding their rhythm, conserving energy. You try to copy them, shortening your steps, pacing your breathing. It helps, a little, but your body is already running on limited resources, and this demands more. You feel it in your legs first, then your chest, then everywhere. And just as you start to adapt, the environment shifts again. Cold air begins to creep in even during the day. The sun is still there, still bright, but it no longer feels as powerful. Shadows linger longer. The wind picks up, cutting through your clothes like it has a personal issue with you. You pull your clothing tighter. It doesn't help much. The Silk Road doesn't specialize in comfort. It specializes in variety, unhelpful variety. You look around, taking in the landscape. Rocky paths, steep inclines, narrow routes that force the caravan into tighter formations. It's beautiful. In a distant, I'm glad I'm not responsible for this kind of way, but you don't have the luxury of appreciating it. Because every change in terrain means one thing. You have to adapt, again and again, and again At this point, you're not just walking a road, you're surviving a series of environments that seem determined to test every possible weakness you have, and somehow, you're still expected to keep up. By now, you've stopped expecting things to make sense, but one thing becomes clearer the longer you stay with the caravan. Not everyone here is on your side. At first, it didn't matter. You were too busy surviving the basics: heat, cold, hunger, thirst. People were just background noise, part of the moving system around you. Now, you start noticing details. A glance that lasts a little too long. A conversation that suddenly stops when you get close. Someone checking their belongings more than necessary. It's subtle, nothing obvious, but enough to make you aware that trust out here is not given freely. It's calculated. You check your own things. Still there, for now. You didn't bring much, but what you do have matters. Water, food, whatever small items you're carrying. Out here, even the smallest loss can become a serious problem. And not everyone follows the same rules. You hear quiet arguments at night, short, tense exchanges that don't escalate, but don't resolve either. Missing goods, disagreements over trade, over space, over responsibility. No one steps in to fix it, because everyone is managing their own risk. You try to stay out of it. Keep your distance. Mind your business. Don't draw attention, which sounds simple, until you realize how difficult that actually is, because you still don't fully understand what's happening around you. You might accidentally stand too close to the wrong group, sit in the wrong place, touch something that isn't yours, and suddenly you're involved in something you didn't even know existed. You adjust your behavior, watch more, speak less, move carefully. You start choosing where you stand, who you walk near, when you eat, when you rest. Everything becomes a decision, even the small things. Because small mistakes out here don't stay small. They grow. You notice the experienced travelers again. They know who to trust, who to avoid, how to navigate the social side of this journey, just as well as the physical one. You don't. Not yet. And that makes you vulnerable in a way that has nothing to do with the environment. Because the desert, the mountains, the weather, they're predictable in their own way. People aren't. And that uncertainty sits with you as you walk, as you rest, as you keep your belongings just a little closer than before. You came here worried about the road. Now you're starting to understand something else. Sometimes the biggest risk isn't where you are, it's who you're with. At some point, you stop focusing only on yourself, not out of kindness, out of curiosity. Because if you're struggling this much, how are the animals doing? You look at the camels, your lifeline on this journey. They carry the goods, the supplies, the things that actually matter to the caravan. Without them, this entire operation collapses, and they look tired. Not dramatically, not in a way that makes anyone stop everything, but in a quiet, undeniable way. Slower steps, heavier movements, the occasional pause that lasts just a second too long. You relate to that, deeply. Their loads are massive, bundles of silk, sacks of spices, tools, supplies, all carefully tied and balanced. Every step they take is effort, constant, unending effort. And unlike you, they don't get to complain internally. They just keep going. You watch as one of them stumbles slightly. Not a full collapse, just a misstep. Enough to shift the load on its back and draw immediate attention from its handler. The reaction is quick. Adjust the load. Tighten the straps. Keep moving. There's no time for anything else. Because here's the reality you're starting to understand. The caravan depends on the animals, but it also expects them to endure, just like it expects you to. You notice how carefully they're managed. When to rest, when to drink, how much they carry. There's a system here, one built over years of experience. But even with that system, this is still hard. The terrain changes, the climate shifts, the journey continues, and the animals feel every part of it. Just like you do, maybe more. At least you chose to be here. At some point, in some way, you made a decision that led you to this road. They didn't. And yet somehow they're handling it better. You watch them move. Steady, patient, consistent. No hesitation. No second guessing. No visible regret. Just forward. It's almost impressive. You try to match that mindset. Less thinking. More moving. Less questioning. More enduring. It helps. A little. But then you feel your legs again. Your shoulders. Your constant low-level exhaustion. And you remember. You're not built for this. Not like they are. Still. You keep walking beside them. Quietly grateful they exist. Because without them, this journey wouldn't just be difficult. It would be impossible. And judging by how things are going, it's already close enough. By now, something has changed. Not around you. The road is still there. The caravan still moves. The conditions are still exactly as unforgiving as before. What's changed is you. You're tired in a way that feels permanent. Not just physically, but mentally. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't go away with rest. Because rest here isn't real. It's just a pause before the next problem. You walk like you've been doing for days, but your thoughts start drifting. Not to the destination, to your decisions. You start asking yourself questions you didn't have time to ask before. Why did I come here? What exactly was I expecting? At the time, it probably sounded reasonable. An opportunity, a journey, maybe even something worth experiencing. Now, it feels like a series of poor life choices connected by walking. You look around, the same faces, the same routine, the same endless movement forward. No clear progress, no visible end, just continuation. And suddenly the idea of reaching the destination feels abstract, distant, almost theoretical. You start thinking about stopping. Not dramatically, not in a heroic, I can't go on kind of way. Just quietly, sitting down, taking a break, letting the caravan move ahead without you. The thought lingers longer than it should, which is concerning because you know what happens if you stop. You've seen it. Not directly, but enough to understand. The caravan doesn't turn around. It doesn't pause. It doesn't reconsider. It continues, with or without you. So stopping isn't really an option. It's a decision. A final one. You push the thought away, focusing back on your steps, one foot in front of the other. Keep moving. Don't overthink it. But your mind doesn't fully cooperate. It keeps circling back to comfort, to safety, to the version of your life where basic things weren't a daily challenge. You remember water that wasn't rationed, food that wasn't strategic, sleep that didn't feel like survival. You miss it. More than you expected. And that's when you realize something quietly unsettling. This journey isn't just testing your body, it's testing your willingness to continue. And that's a different kind of challenge. Because muscles recover, energy returns. But motivation? That's harder to hold on to when every single day feels like a repetition of the last. With no guarantee it gets better. You keep walking, not because you're confident, not because you're strong, but because you haven't stopped yet. And for now, that's enough. Long before she became a queen, twice, Eleanor of Aquitaine was already something far more dangerous. A woman who understood her own power. Born into one of the richest and most culturally vibrant regions in medieval Europe, she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine while still young, instantly becoming one of the most desirable and politically valuable women on the continent. But Eleanor was never content with simply being valuable. She wanted to be heard. Aquitaine was not like the rigid courts of the north. It was alive with poetry, music, and the ideals of courtly love, where admiration, flirtation, and emotional expression were not only accepted, but celebrated. Eleanor grew up surrounded by troubadours who sang of passion and devotion, shaping her view of relationships in a way that would later shock more conservative courts. While most noblewomen were expected to remain quiet, obedient, and invisible, Eleanor was being raised in a culture that encouraged charisma and presence, and she embraced it fully, When she married King Louis VII of France, she brought more than land into the union. She brought a personality that simply did not fit the expectations of a medieval queen. Louis was deeply religious, reserved, and almost monk-like in his behaviour. Eleanor, on the other hand, was confident, expressive, and to many, dangerously charming. It didn't take long for tensions to grow between them. At court, whispers began almost immediately. Eleanor's openness, her love of music and poetry, and her ease in male-dominated spaces made people uncomfortable. She spoke her mind. She laughed loudly. She surrounded herself with admirers and intellectuals. To some, this made her captivating. To others, it made her suspicious. In a world where a woman's reputation could be shattered by the smallest rumour, Eleanor was constantly walking a thin line. And then came the Crusade. When Eleanor accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, she did something almost unheard of. She travelled not just as a passive queen, but as a leader of her own retinue. She dressed boldly, acted independently, and formed alliances that bypassed her husband entirely. This only fueled the rumours. Stories began to spread about her relationships with powerful men, most notably her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. Whether true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that Eleanor had become a problem, not because of proven betrayal, but because she refused to behave the way a queen was supposed to, and in medieval Europe, that alone was enough to make her dangerous. If Eleanor of Aquitaine entered her marriage with hope, it didn't last long. Her union with Louis VII of France was, from the very beginning, a mismatch of personalities so stark it almost feels inevitable in hindsight. He was devout, cautious, and painfully reserved. She was vibrant, outspoken, and impossible to ignore. Together, they were less a royal couple and more a quiet disaster waiting to unfold. At first, the marriage seemed politically perfect. Eleanor brought Aquitaine, an enormous and wealthy territory, under the French crown. Louis gained power, Eleanor gained a throne, but behind the polished image, cracks were already forming. Louis admired piety above all else. He preferred prayer to politics, contemplation to conversation. Eleanor, on the other hand, thrived in the social and cultural life of the court. She hosted gatherings, encouraged poetry, and surrounded herself with thinkers, artists, and noblemen who were drawn to her energy. Where Louis saw restraint as virtue, Eleanor saw it as suffocating, and slowly resentment began to grow. Their relationship became increasingly strained, especially as the pressure to produce a male heir intensified. Years passed, and Eleanor gave birth only to daughters. In a time where a queen's primary duty was to secure the dynasty, this failure, unfair as it was, hung heavily over her. Louis grew distant. Eleanor grew frustrated. The marriage began to feel less like a partnership and more like an obligation neither of them wanted. But the real breaking point came during the Second Crusade. What was meant to be a holy mission turned into a stage for their personal conflict. Eleanor insisted on joining the journey, bringing her own retinue and maintaining a level of independence that deeply unsettled Louis. She made decisions, formed connections, and carried herself not as a subordinate, but as an equal, something Louis was neither prepared for nor comfortable with. Rumours spread quickly. Her closeness with powerful figures, her refusal to fade into the background, and her visible dissatisfaction with her husband all fed into a growing narrative. That Eleanor was not just unhappy, but potentially unfaithful. Whether there was truth to these claims didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, perception was everything. By the time they returned from the crusade, their marriage was effectively over. What remained was a fragile arrangement held together only by politics and appearances. But even that wouldn't last much longer. Eleanor was already beginning to realize something dangerous. She didn't need to stay. If the marriage between Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII was already fragile, Antioch shattered whatever remained of it. What happened there would become one of the most whispered about episodes of her life. A scandal so persistent that even centuries later, historians still debate what truly occurred. When the royal couple arrived in Antioch during the Second Crusade, they were welcomed by Raymond of Poitiers, Eleanor's uncle. But this was no ordinary family reunion. Raymond was everything Louis was not: charismatic, confident, politically sharp, and perhaps most dangerously, able to match Eleanor's energy. For the first time in years, Eleanor was in the presence of someone who understood her. Raymond valued strategy over blind devotion. He saw the crusade not just as a spiritual mission, but as a political opportunity, and Eleanor agreed. The two spent long hours discussing military plans, alliances, and the future of the region. She listened, contributed, and engaged in a way that made her feel relevant again, something she had been denied in her own marriage. Louis, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines. To him, this closeness looked suspicious. Eleanor's growing alignment with Raymond, both intellectually and politically, created tension that quickly spread through the court. Whispers began circulating, quiet at first, then louder. It wasn't just that Eleanor supported her uncle's strategy, it was how she did it. The way they spoke, the time they spent together, the visible bond between them. And in a medieval court, perception was everything. Soon, rumors of an inappropriate relationship began to take shape. Some claimed it was emotional, others went further, suggesting something physical. There was no solid proof, but that didn't matter. Once the idea was planted, it spread like wildfire. Eleanor, already viewed as too bold, too independent, now found herself painted as something even worse. Louis reached his breaking point. He demanded that Eleanor leave Antioch immediately and continue the crusade with him. But for once she refused. She argued that she had a duty to Aquitaine and to the cause they were supposed to support. She challenged him openly, even suggesting that their marriage itself was flawed, possibly invalid due to their blood relation. That was the moment everything changed. Louis didn't negotiate. He didn't argue. He acted. According to several accounts, Eleanor was forced to leave Antioch against her will, essentially dragged away from the one place where she had felt in control. Whatever bond existed between her and Raymond was cut abruptly, leaving behind only rumors, and a marriage that was now beyond repair. After Antioch, there was no saving the marriage. Whatever fragile connection had once existed between Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII had been stripped away, leaving behind only resentment, suspicion, and political inconvenience. They returned to France not as a united royal couple, but as two people quietly preparing for separation, and Eleanor was no longer willing to play the role expected of her. Back in France, the tension became impossible to hide. The court had already been filled with rumors about Antioch, about Raymond, about Eleanor's behavior, and now those whispers turned into open speculation. A queen who openly challenged her husband, who refused to submit quietly, was already dangerous. But a queen surrounded by scandal? That was unacceptable. Eleanor made a bold move. She began pushing for an annulment. Now, ending a royal marriage in the 12th century wasn't simple. It required justification, something that would appear legitimate in the eyes of the church. Conveniently, Eleanor and Louis were related by blood, though distantly. It was a technicality that had been ignored when the marriage was politically useful. Now it became the perfect escape. The process moved forward. In the year 1152, the marriage was officially annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. It was a clean legal solution to what had become a deeply messy situation. Their two daughters were declared legitimate, but the union itself was erased, as if it had never truly existed. And just like that, Eleanor was no longer Queen of France. But what seemed like a fall was actually something far more dangerous. She was free, and not just free, she was the most eligible woman in Europe. As Duchess of Aquitaine, she still controlled vast lands and immense wealth. Any man who married her wouldn't just gain a wife, but an entire region. Kings, princes, and ambitious nobles immediately turned their attention toward her, which also made her a target. Travelling across France as an unmarried woman of such importance was incredibly risky. There were even reported attempts to abduct her, powerful men hoping to force a marriage and claim her lands. But Eleanor was not easily controlled. She moved quickly, decisively, and with a clear understanding of the game being played around her. And then, in one of the most shocking moves of her life, she made a decision that would change the course of history. Just weeks after her annulment, Eleanor chose a new husband. Not a cautious one, not a safe one, but a young, ambitious, and dangerously charismatic man named Henry, soon to be known as Henry II of England. If Eleanor of Aquitaine's annulment shocked Europe, what she did next stunned it completely. Within weeks of ending her marriage to Louis VII, she married Henry II of England, a man nearly a decade younger than her, fiercely ambitious, and already on the path to becoming one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. This wasn't a slow, cautious alliance. It was fast, calculated, and to many, reckless. But Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing. Henry was nothing like Louis. Where Louis hesitated, Henry acted. Where Louis prayed, Henry planned. He was energetic, intelligent, and relentless. A man who didn't just inherit power, but expanded it. For Eleanor, this wasn't just a new marriage. It was a return to influence. Together, they formed something far more formidable than her previous union. When Henry became King of England, their combined territories created what historians now call the Angevin Empire, a vast stretch of land that rivaled, and in many ways surpassed, the power of the French crown. Ironically, Eleanor, once Queen of France, now stood beside a man who was technically a vassal to her former husband, but in reality, far more powerful, and that did not go unnoticed. But while their political partnership was strong, their personal relationship was far from stable. Henry was charismatic, yes, but he was also notoriously unfaithful. Unlike Louis, who had been distant and restrained, Henry indulged in his desires openly. He surrounded himself with mistresses, courtiers, and admirers, rarely making any effort to hide his affairs. For Eleanor, a woman already sensitive to reputation and perception, this was both humiliating and infuriating. At first she tolerated it. She focused on her role as queen, managing lands, raising their children, and maintaining the political strength of their empire. And in this she excelled. Eleanor was not a passive consort. She governed territories, influenced decisions, and remained deeply involved in the workings of power. But over time, Henry's behavior became impossible to ignore. Among his many affairs, one stood out above the rest: his relationship with Rosamund Clifford. Unlike the fleeting connections that came and went, this one carried a sense of permanence, even affection. Rumours spread quickly, painting Rosamund not just as a mistress but as something closer to a rival, and Eleanor noticed. Whether driven by jealousy, pride, or something deeper, the situation began to shift. The woman who had once been accused of scandal was now watching her own husband create one after another. And this time, she wasn't the subject of the whispers. She was the one listening, and slowly, quietly, Eleanor began to change her approach. At first, Eleanor of Aquitaine endured Henry's betrayals with a kind of controlled silence. She had seen enough of court politics to understand that kings often strayed, and queens were expected to look the other way. But this was different. Henry II did not simply take discreet lovers, he flaunted them, and over time, one name began to rise above the rest: Rosamund Clifford. Unlike the others, Rosamund was not a passing distraction. She became a presence, a constant, and that was something Eleanor could not ignore. Whispers spread across the court, growing sharper with each retelling. Some claimed Henry hid Rosamund away in a secret residence, shielded from the world. Others insisted he openly favoured her, treating her with a level of affection that bordered on dangerous. Whether exaggerated or not, the message was clear. Eleanor was no longer the centre of his attention, and for a woman like Eleanor, that was not just a personal insult, it was a political threat. A queen's influence depended on her position at court. If Henry's loyalty shifted, even emotionally, it could weaken her authority, her alliances, and ultimately her control. Eleanor understood this better than anyone. She had fought too hard to become powerful again after her first marriage. She would not be quietly replaced, but instead of reacting publicly, she adapted. Eleanor withdrew from Henry's immediate court and returned to Aquitaine, her own domain. It was a strategic move, not a retreat. There, she ruled independently, strengthening her influence, cultivating loyalty, and building a base of power separate from her husband. While Henry remained busy governing his vast empire, Eleanor was quietly securing her own position. And in doing so, she became something unusual, almost a ruler in her own right. But distance did not erase resentment. The stories of Rosamund continued to circulate, growing more dramatic over time. Some later legends even claimed Eleanor took revenge, though historians debate the truth of such tales. What matters is not whether those stories were real, but that people believed they could be. That alone speaks volumes about how Eleanor was perceived. Strong, proud, and not someone to be humiliated without consequence. Meanwhile, Henry's behavior showed no signs of changing. His affairs continued. His authority remained absolute, and his disregard for Eleanor's position only deepened the divide between them. What had once been a powerful partnership was now becoming something else entirely. A quiet rivalry, filled with tension, pride, and unspoken hostility. And Eleanor once again found herself in a familiar position. Not just a queen, but a woman surrounded by whispers, watching closely, and waiting for the right moment to act. By the time Eleanor of Aquitaine withdrew to her own lands, the cracks in her marriage to Henry II had turned into something far more dangerous. This was no longer just about affairs, pride, or humiliation. It was about power, and who would control it next. And at the centre of it all were her sons. Eleanor had given Henry multiple heirs, including Henry the young king, Richard I of England, and Geoffrey II, Duke of Brittany. Each of them had been raised not just as princes, but as future rulers with ambition, pride, and expectations. And yet Henry refused to give them real power. He crowned his eldest son, Henry the young king, during his own lifetime, a rare and symbolic move, but denied him actual authority. The title meant everything and nothing at the same time. The younger Henry was king in name, but powerless in reality. And that kind of frustration does not stay quiet for long. Eleanor saw it building. Her sons were growing restless, humiliated by their father's control and lack of trust. They wanted land, independence, recognition. Henry offered promises, delays, and half measures. It was a recipe for rebellion. And then something shifted. Eleanor didn't just observe the tension. She began to influence it, whether driven by resentment toward Henry, concern for her sons, or a calculated understanding of opportunity. Eleanor started to support their growing dissatisfaction. She encouraged their ambitions, validated their frustrations, and slowly helped unite them against a common enemy, their own father. It was a dangerous move. In 1173, the situation exploded into open revolt. Henry the young king, joined by his brothers Richard and Geoffrey, rose up against Henry II. They were backed not just by their mother's influence, but by powerful allies across Europe, including, ironically, Eleanor's former husband, Louis VII of France. What had once been a personal conflict had now become a full-scale political crisis. For Eleanor, this was more than rebellion, it was a gamble. If her sons succeeded, she would stand beside them as the architect of a new balance of power. If they failed, the consequences would be severe, far beyond damaged reputation or court gossip. And fail they did. Henry II moved quickly and decisively, crushing the rebellion with force. One by one, the uprising collapsed. Alliances fell apart. Support vanished. And Eleanor, the woman who had helped set it all in motion, found herself exposed. This time, there would be no quiet withdrawal, no clever escape. Henry had been betrayed, and he was about to respond. The rebellion had failed, and this time, Eleanor of Aquitaine could not simply step away and rebuild elsewhere. Henry II had been challenged not just by disobedient sons, but by his own wife, a woman who had actively supported the uprising against him. This was no longer a private matter, it was betrayal. And Henry did not forgive betrayal. As the revolt collapsed, Eleanor attempted to escape. According to several accounts, she disguised herself, possibly even dressing as a man, and tried to flee towards safety. But she didn't make it far. She was captured before she could reach refuge, and from that moment on, her fate was sealed. There would be no negotiation. Henry ordered her imprisonment. Not a brief confinement, not a symbolic punishment. Eleanor was held under guard for years, moved between castles, kept isolated, and stripped of the freedom she had fought her entire life to maintain. For a woman who had once commanded vast lands and influenced kings, the fall was dramatic. But even in captivity, Eleanor was not entirely erased. She remained technically Queen of England. She was still the mother of Henry's heirs, and while she was kept out of power, she was never completely forgotten. On rare occasions, especially during important ceremonies, she was brought back into public view, a reminder of her status and her connection to the royal line. But these moments were controlled, brief, and carefully managed. Most of her life during this period was spent in confinement. Years passed. Her sons, once united in rebellion, were now navigating their own complicated relationships with their father. Some reconciled, others continued to resist in quieter ways. The political landscape shifted constantly, but Eleanor remained locked away, watching from a distance, unable to directly shape events as she once had. And yet, something about her endurance is striking. She did not disappear into obscurity. She waited. Through changing alliances, through the deaths of those around her, through the slow unraveling of Henry's later years, Eleanor remained a silent presence, removed from the center, but never entirely out of the picture. Then, after nearly 15 years of confinement, everything changed. In 1189, Henry II died, and with his death, the chains that had held Eleanor in place for so long were finally broken. But Eleanor was no longer the same woman who had been imprisoned. She was older, sharper, and perhaps more dangerous than ever, because now she was free again, and this time she had nothing left to lose. When Henry II of England died in 1189, Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just regain her freedom, she reclaimed her power. After nearly 15 years of confinement, she stepped back into the political world with a speed and confidence that stunned everyone watching. There was no hesitation, no adjustment period. It was as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. And now, the game was hers again. Her son, Richard I of England, ascended the throne almost immediately. But Richard was not a king who intended to stay home. His ambitions were focused on the Third Crusade, which meant leaving England for long stretches of time. And that created a familiar situation. Someone needed to rule in his absence. That someone was Eleanor. At an age when most would have withdrawn from public life, Eleanor became the true stabilizing force of the kingdom. She managed political affairs, handled disputes, secured alliances, and ensured that Richard's authority remained intact, even while he was thousands of miles away. It was not a ceremonial role, it was real power, exercised with experience and precision. But her challenges were far from over. When Richard was captured and held for ransom on his way back from the crusade, the kingdom entered a period of uncertainty. Enemies saw opportunity, rivals began to circle, and once again Eleanor stepped forward. she took charge of raising the enormous ransom required for his release, travelling across lands, negotiating, and maintaining control during a moment that could have easily spiraled into chaos. She succeeded. Richard returned, his throne secure, thanks largely to his mother's relentless efforts. But fate would not give Eleanor peace for long. After Richard's death, the crown passed to her youngest son, John, King of England, a ruler far less admired, far less stable, and far more difficult to manage. And yet, even then, Eleanor remained involved. Well into her later years, she continued to influence politics, arrange marriages, and secure alliances. One of her most remarkable acts was travelling across Europe to escort her granddaughter for a royal marriage, ensuring the continuation of her family's power and legacy. By the end of her life, Eleanor had outlived 2 husbands, witnessed the rise and fall of kings, endured imprisonment, scandal, and rebellion, and still remained standing. Her story was never just about affairs or rumours. It was about survival, in a world that tried to silence her, control her, and contain her. Eleanor of Aquitaine did something almost unthinkable. She refused to disappear, and in doing so, she became one of the most powerful and unforgettable women of the medieval world. To understand what it was like to be a messenger in the Mongol Empire, you have to forget everything you think you know about travel in the medieval world. This wasn't slow, this wasn't uncertain. This was speed, controlled, enforced, and if you failed to keep up, punished. Under the rule of Genghis Khan, the Mongols created something extraordinary. A communication network so efficient it could carry messages across continents faster than most armies could march a single region. This system, known as the Yam, wasn't just a collection of roads. It was a carefully organized machine built for one purpose, keeping the empire connected at all times. And you were one of its moving parts. As a messenger, you didn't own your time, your comfort, or even your safety. You belonged to the road. The moment a message was placed in your hands, everything else became secondary. You rode hard, fast, and without hesitation, because delays were not just inconvenient, they could be deadly for someone else, somewhere far away. The Yam made this speed possible. Along the routes were relay stations, placed at regular intervals, each stocked with fresh horses, food, and basic shelter. When you arrived, exhausted and covered in dust, you didn't rest for long. You handed over your tired horse, grabbed a fresh one, and continued almost immediately. The system allowed messages to travel incredible distances in a matter of days, sometimes even faster. But that speed came at a cost. The roads themselves were unforgiving. One moment you could be riding across open steppe under a wide, empty sky. The next you'd be climbing through harsh mountain paths or crossing dry, wind-beaten deserts. There were no guarantees of safety. Bandits, harsh weather, and simple exhaustion were constant threats, and yet stopping was not an option. Because the message always came first. You carried more than words. You carried orders, military plans, intelligence, sometimes the difference between victory and disaster. And that meant you were both important and expendable at the same time. If you failed, another messenger would be sent. The system would continue. It always did. That was the reality of the fastest roads in the world. Not comfort, not glory, just speed, pressure, and the quiet understanding that somewhere far ahead, someone was waiting. And you were expected to get there no matter what. Not everyone could become a messenger in the Mongol Empire. This wasn't a role given lightly, and it certainly wasn't for the weak. If you were chosen, it meant one thing. You were expected to endure more than most people ever could. The selection process was not formal in the way modern systems might be, but it was brutally effective. You were picked because you could ride, not casually, not comfortably, but relentlessly. You needed balance, stamina, and the ability to stay in the saddle for hours, sometimes days, with minimal rest. If you couldn't control a horse at full speed across uneven terrain, you were useless. And useless was not a word you wanted associated with your name. Many messengers came from nomadic backgrounds, where riding wasn't a skill, it was a way of life. From a young age, they learned how to handle horses, how to read the land, and how to survive in harsh conditions. By the time they were old enough to serve, they were already hardened, already prepared, but even that wasn't enough. You also needed discipline, absolute discipline. When you carried a message, it wasn't yours. You didn't question it, you didn't delay it, and you certainly didn't tamper with it. Whether it was a simple administrative order or a critical military command, your responsibility was the same. Deliver it exactly as intended, as fast as possible. Trust was everything. Messengers were often given a paitsa, a small tablet or badge that proved their authority. With it, you could demand fresh horses, food, and assistance from anyone along the route. Villagers, officials, even soldiers were required to help you. Refusing a messenger was not just disrespectful, it could bring severe punishment. So when you rode into a station, you weren't just another traveler, you were someone the system depended on. But that authority came with pressure. Everyone expected you to move quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. The moment you slowed down, you became a problem. And problems didn't last long in a system built on precision and speed. There was also an unspoken understanding among messengers themselves. You didn't compete, but you knew the standard. You knew how fast others rode, how far they could go, how long they could endure. Falling behind wasn't just personal failure, it reflected on your reliability. And in an empire where communication held everything together, reliability was not optional. So if you were chosen, it wasn't a privilege. It was a test, a constant, exhausting test of endurance, loyalty, and control. One that began the moment you took the message and didn't end until it was finally out of your hands. Once you were chosen and the message was placed in your hands, your life fell into a rhythm that never really stopped. It just repeated over and over again until the job was done. Ride, arrive, change horses, ride again. That was it. There was no comfort in the routine, only pressure. You pushed your horse hard across the open steppe, feeling every jolt of uneven ground beneath you, every gust of wind cutting across your face. Hours blurred together. The landscape changed slowly, but your pace never did. You weren't traveling, you were racing time itself, and time was always winning. When you finally reached a relay station, you didn't collapse into rest. You didn't sit down for a long meal or recover properly. You handed over your exhausted horse, grabbed a fresh one, already prepared and waiting, and moved again almost immediately. The entire exchange was designed to take minutes, not hours. The system depended on your momentum. Each station was a checkpoint, not a refuge. Yes, there was food, sometimes water, maybe even a place to catch your breath for a few moments. But those moments were short, controlled, and often barely enough to steady yourself before you were pushed back into motion. Because the message didn't wait. Day turned into night, and night into day, often without much difference. You rode in darkness just as you did in sunlight, guided by memory, instinct, and the faint outlines of the road ahead. There were no lantern-lit paths or safe resting points, just the endless stretch of land and the quiet understanding that stopping too long could cost you everything. Fatigue became part of you. Your body adapted in strange ways. You learned how to stay balanced while barely conscious, how to eat quickly without dismounting for long, how to ignore the constant ache in your muscles. Sleep was no longer a proper rest. It became something fragmented, stolen in small moments when the system allowed it. But even exhaustion wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was knowing that you couldn't slow down. No matter how tired you were, no matter how rough the terrain became, no matter how badly your body wanted to stop, you kept going. Because somewhere ahead, another station was waiting. Another horse. Another stretch of road. And until the message was delivered, that rhythm never broke. That relentless rhythm would almost be manageable if the road itself didn't try to kill you. Because the truth is, the real danger of being a messenger in the Mongol Empire wasn't the speed or even the exhaustion. It was everything that waited between the relay stations, the empty stretches, the silence, the long miles where no one would hear you if something went wrong. And something always could. The Mongol roads were vast, but they weren't protected every step of the way. Outside the immediate reach of the Empire's control, bandits still existed. Desperate men who knew that messengers often carried valuable information, and sometimes even small items of importance. You weren't just fast, you were a target, and unlike soldiers, you didn't travel in groups. If someone decided to stop you, you had only two options: outrun them, or face them alone. Most chose speed, always speed, because stopping to fight meant losing time. And losing time could be just as dangerous as losing your life. Then there was the land itself. The Mongol Empire stretched across extremes. You could be riding under a burning sun one day, your throat dry and your vision blurring from heat, and then find yourself battling freezing winds the next, your fingers stiff on the reins. Sandstorms could blind you. Snow could erase the path entirely. Rivers could swell without warning, turning a simple crossing into a deadly risk. And still, you rode. There were no guarantees that you would make it to the next station. Horses stumbled. Paths disappeared. Weather changed without mercy. Sometimes messengers simply didn't arrive. No explanation. No trace. The road took them, and the system moved on. Because it had to. Illness was another silent threat. You pushed your body past its limits constantly, eating irregularly, sleeping barely enough to function. A fever, a wound, even something small could become serious when you were alone, far from help, with no option to stop. But stopping was never really an option anyway. That was the rule no one needed to say out loud. The message mattered more than you, so you learned to ignore fear, to trust your horse, to read the sky, the ground, the movement of distant figures, every instinct sharpened, every sense alert, because the space between stations was where the real test happened, not just of your speed, but of whether you could survive long enough to use it. If the road was dangerous and the pace relentless, there was one thing that gave you an edge: authority. Not the kind that came from a sword or a title, but something smaller, quieter, and far more powerful: the paisa. The paisa was a simple object, often made of metal or wood, worn or carried as proof of your role. But in the Mongol Empire, it was more than identification. It was a command, a symbol that said you were acting on behalf of the state itself, and that no one had the right to slow you down. When you carried a paisa, doors opened. You could ride into a settlement without explanation and demand what you needed: fresh horses, food, shelter, guidance. Villagers were expected to comply. Officials were required to assist. Even local leaders understood that your presence meant urgency. Refusing you wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous, because the system protected its messengers, and yet that authority came with its own tension. Every time you presented your paisa, you were making a statement that your journey mattered more than whatever anyone else was doing, that your need for speed overruled their need for rest, their resources, their time. Most people accepted it without question, but not all did so willingly. You could feel it, the hesitation, the quiet frustration, the unspoken resentment from those who had to give up their best horse, their stored food, or their limited supplies just because you arrived. You didn't have time to argue or explain. You simply took what was required and moved on. Because again, the message came first. There was also risk in carrying such visible authority. The paisa made your life easier at the stations, but it also marked you as important. If someone wanted to disrupt communication, you were an obvious target. Your speed protected you, but your role exposed you. You were both respected and vulnerable at the same time, and you couldn't afford to misuse it. If a messenger abused their authority, took more than needed, delayed without reason, or acted outside their duty, the consequences could be severe. The Mongol system relied on discipline. Without it, the entire network would begin to break down. So you learned balance. Use the paisa when necessary. Move quickly. Take only what you needed. Leave no reason for complaint. Because your authority wasn't personal, it was borrowed from something much larger. And the moment you failed to live up to it, it could be taken away just as quickly as it was given. Out on the road, the paisa wasn't just a tool. It was your permission to keep going. By now you've learned the rhythm, survived the road, and carried the authority of the paisa. But none of that matters without one thing, the message itself. Because what you carried was never just ink on parchment. It could be an order from Genghis Khan himself, or later, from Kublai Khan. And when a message came from the top, it didn't just travel, it reshaped entire regions. Armies moved because of it. Cities surrendered because of it. Lives were decided long before anyone ever saw you arrive, and you were the one holding it. That weight sat quietly in your hands as you rode. No one stopped you to ask what it said. In most cases, you didn't even know yourself. Messages were often sealed, protected, and meant only for the eyes of those who would receive them. Your job wasn't to understand. It was to deliver, but you could feel the importance anyway. Sometimes it was in the urgency of the order, the way you were told to ride faster, to skip even the smallest delay. Other times, it was in the reaction of those who handed it to you, the tension in their voice, the way they looked at you as if everything depended on your speed. Because sometimes it did. A delayed message could mean an army marching too late or too early. It could mean a governor acting without proper orders. It could mean confusion, miscalculation, or disaster. In an empire as vast as the Mongol world, communication wasn't just helpful, it was everything. And that made you essential, but it also made you invisible. No one praised the messenger when things went right. Victories were credited to generals. Stability was credited to rulers. Your role was to ensure the message arrived, not to share in its consequences. Success meant silence. Failure meant blame. There was no middle ground. And occasionally, the message itself could put you in danger. If you carried bad news, you had no control over how it would be received. A ruler, hearing of defeat, betrayal, or loss, might react unpredictably. You were the one standing in front of them, delivering words that could spark anger, grief, or violence. And yet you couldn't hesitate, because the system didn't care what the message contained. It only cared that it moved. So you rode, carrying decisions you didn't make, consequences you wouldn't face, and outcomes you would never fully see. All that mattered was one thing, getting it there in time. By now the road has become your world. The rhythm, the danger, the pressure. It all blends together into something almost mechanical. But there is one part of this life that never becomes easier. The nights. When the sun disappears, the road does not forgive you. It does not slow down. It does not become safer. If anything, it becomes more uncertain. Shadows stretch across the land. Familiar paths blur into darkness, and every sound feels sharper, closer, more threatening. And still you ride. There are no comfortable stops waiting for you at sunset. No warm beds, no long fireside meals. At best, you reach a relay station where you can pause briefly, grab food, maybe drink something warm if you're lucky. But even then it's temporary. The system does not allow long rest, and the message does not wait for daylight. So you learn to function in fragments. Sleep is no longer a full night's escape. It becomes something broken, stolen in small moments. 10 minutes here, a short collapse there, just enough to keep your body from completely failing. Sometimes you don't even dismount properly. You sit, half aware, leaning against a wall or your saddle, knowing that in moments you'll be forced to move again. Your body starts to change. Your sense of time fades. Days and nights lose their meaning, replaced by distance and urgency. You stop thinking in hours and begin thinking in stations. How far to the next horse? How long until you can slow down? How much longer you can push before your legs and arms begin to betray you, and the darkness plays tricks on you, out on the open steppe, with no walls, no lights, and no clear boundaries. Your mind begins to fill the silence. Every distant movement could be a threat. Every shadow could be a person, or nothing at all. The wind alone can sound like footsteps. Your instincts stay sharp, but your thoughts begin to drift, pulled between focus and exhaustion. This is where many falter, not because they lack strength, but because the mind starts to slip. Doubt creeps in. Fatigue whispers that slowing down just for a moment wouldn't matter, that no one would notice, that one longer rest wouldn't change anything. But you know better, because the moment you allow yourself to fall out of rhythm, even slightly, everything becomes harder. Your body stiffens. Your reaction slows. The road feels longer, heavier, more hostile, so you keep going through darkness, through silence, through the constant pull of exhaustion. Because in this life, rest isn't something you're given. It's something you survive without. Up until now, everything has depended on one assumption, that the system works. The horses are ready, the stations are stocked, the roads are passable, the rhythm holds. But sometimes it doesn't, and when the system breaks, you are the one who feels it first. It might start small. You arrive at a relay station expecting a fresh horse, only to find chaos. No preparation, no urgency, maybe not even a proper animal ready to ride. Supplies might be low, the people there might be exhausted, disorganized, or simply unprepared for your arrival. And suddenly, the speed you rely on begins to slip. Even a short delay feels dangerous, because once the rhythm is broken, it's hard to rebuild. You lose momentum, your body cools down, stiffens, your focus shifts. The pressure doesn't disappear, it increases. Now you're not just riding fast, you're trying to make up for lost time, and that's when mistakes happen. Sometimes the failure is bigger. Storms can hit without warning, flooding paths, turning dry land into mud that slows your horse to a crawl. Snow can erase entire routes, forcing you to rely on instinct rather than direction. Rivers can become impassable, cutting off the fastest path and forcing you into dangerous detours. And then there are moments of human failure. Stations that were once reliable may be abandoned or poorly maintained. Officials might not respond quickly enough. Horses may be overworked, weak, or injured. In a system this vast, even small breakdowns can ripple outward, affecting everything that depends on it, including you. Because when things go wrong, the expectation doesn't change. You are still supposed to deliver the message on time. There are no excuses. You can't return and explain. You can't simply say the road was difficult or the station failed you. The message must move forward, no matter what stands in your way. And that means adapting, quickly, decisively, sometimes dangerously. You might push a tired horse further than you should. You might take a riskier route. You might ride longer without rest, ignoring the warning signs your body is giving you. Because failure is not measured by effort, it's measured by outcome. And the system, even when it breaks, still expects results. So you learn something important out here. Not everything is under control. Not every road is reliable. Not every station will save you. But none of that changes your role. When the system fails, you don't stop. You become the system. By the time you deliver your final message, whether days or weeks after you first set out, you don't feel relief the way you imagined you would. There's no dramatic moment, no celebration, just a quiet exchange. You hand over the message, confirm its arrival, and that's it. The road doesn't end. Because even when the journey is technically over, something about it stays with you. Your body is still tense, still expecting movement. Your ears are tuned to the sounds of hooves, wind, distant threats. Even when you stand still, it feels temporary, like you're only pausing before the next ride. Rest doesn't come easily anymore. Real rest, the kind where you let go completely, feels unfamiliar. You've spent too long living without it. And then there's your mind. You start to realize how much you've changed. The hesitation most people have, the instinct to slow down, to question, to doubt, it's been stripped away. Out on the road, you didn't have time for that. You made decisions quickly. You trusted your instincts. You kept moving, no matter what. And now standing still feels strange. People around you talk normally. They move at a different pace. They worry about things that to you feel distant, almost irrelevant. You've seen how fast everything can change, how fragile plans can be, how much depends on timing alone. You've carried that weight, and even if no one else sees it, you know what you've done. You've been part of something larger than yourself, a system that held an empire together across impossible distances. Armies moved because of riders like you. Orders were obeyed because you arrived on time. Stability, control, power, it all depended on the road, and on people who could survive it. But there's a quiet truth that settles in after enough journeys. You were never meant to stay still for long. Sooner or later, another message comes. Another order. Another journey that needs to happen faster than anyone else can manage. And when it does, there's no hesitation, no debate. You take it, because the road has already claimed you. Not in a dramatic way, not with chains or force, but in something much simpler and far more permanent. You've learned its rhythm, its demands, its silence. And once you understand that fully and completely, you never really leave it behind. You just wait for the next ride. At first glance, a medieval nunnery looked like the safest place a woman could be. High stone walls, heavy wooden doors, quiet courtyards filled with prayer and routine. From the outside, it seemed like a world removed from danger, a place where women devoted themselves entirely to God, far from the violence, politics, and uncertainty of medieval life. But that image, as peaceful as it sounds, was only part of the story. Inside those walls lived women who had not all chosen to be there. Some entered out of genuine faith, believing in a life of devotion, silence, and spiritual purpose. But many others arrived for very different reasons. Families, especially noble ones, often placed daughters in nunneries to avoid the cost of a dowry or to secure control over inheritance. A daughter in a convent could not marry, could not divide property, and could not complicate political alliances. So for many, the decision was never theirs. Some girls entered as children, too young to fully understand what vows meant. They grew up within the walls, learning the rules, the prayers, the discipline, long before they could question it. And by the time they were old enough to think differently, leaving was no longer an option, because once the vows were taken, they were meant to be permanent. Life inside followed a strict structure. Days were divided by prayer, work, and silence. You woke before dawn, attended services, performed duties, cooking, cleaning, copying texts, and returned again and again to prayer. It was repetitive, controlled, and designed to remove distraction. But removing distraction didn't remove human nature. Behind the routine, emotions still existed. Frustration, curiosity, loneliness. Some women adapted, finding meaning in the structure. Others struggled with it. The walls that were meant to protect also confined, creating a world where desires, whether for freedom, connection, or influence, didn't disappear. They simply had nowhere to go. And that's where things began to shift. Because when you place dozens of people together in isolation, with strict rules but limited oversight, something inevitable happens. The ideal of perfect discipline begins to crack. Small rule breaking turns into quiet rebellion. Relationships form, secrets grow, and over time, those secrets become stories. Stories that rarely left the walls, unless something went wrong. So while nunneries were built as places of purity and control, the reality inside was far more complicated. Not always scandalous, not always corrupt, but far from the perfect silence the outside world imagined. Because behind closed walls, people are still people, And eventually, that always shows. Once you understand that nunneries weren't always places of choice, everything else starts to make more sense. Because the biggest secret wasn't what happened inside. It was how many women never wanted to be there in the first place. For many families, especially among the nobility, a daughter wasn't just a child. She was an asset. Marrying her off required a dowry, often expensive and politically complicated, but sending her to a convent? That was cheaper, cleaner, and far more controlled. Once she took her vows, she was effectively removed from the game. No marriage, no inheritance disputes, no risk. And so, many girls were sent away. Some entered as children, placed in nunneries long before they could fully understand what their future would look like. They were raised within those walls, taught obedience, prayer, and discipline as if it were the only life available. By the time they reached adulthood, the path had already been decided for them, and questioning it was not encouraged. Others arrived later, fully aware of what they were losing. These women had known life outside. Family, movement, possibility. Being placed into a convent wasn't a spiritual calling. It was a forced transition. And that kind of shift doesn't happen quietly. Resentment builds. You follow the rules, you attend the prayers, you perform your duties, but internally, something resists. The structure that was meant to bring peace instead feels restrictive. The silence feels heavy. The repetition becomes suffocating, and in that environment, even small acts of independence begin to matter. A longer conversation than allowed, a glance held too long, a moment of laughter during silence. These things seem insignificant from the outside, but inside, they become a form of resistance, a way to reclaim some sense of control in a life that was never fully yours. Over time, those small moments grow. Friendships deepen, alliances form. Some women find comfort in each other, creating bonds that go beyond what the rules intended. Others begin to push boundaries more directly, testing how far they can go before consequences appear. And sometimes, they go further than anyone expected. Because when a life is imposed rather than chosen, the rules that come with it don't carry the same weight. Obedience becomes something external, not internal. Something performed, not believed. And that's where the first real cracks in the system appear. Not in the structure itself, but in the people living inside it. If Chapter 2 explained why many women resisted the life, this chapter explains why that resistance mattered so much. Because nunneries were not loosely run communities. They were built on rules, strict, detailed, and constant. Every part of daily life was controlled, from when you woke up to how you spoke, from what you ate to who you could look at. The goal was simple: remove temptation. But controlling human behavior that completely is harder than it sounds. The daily routine followed a rigid structure. You woke before dawn for prayers, attended multiple services throughout the day, and filled the remaining time with labor, cooking, cleaning, tending gardens, or copying manuscripts. Silence was often enforced, especially during meals and certain hours. Even conversations were regulated. And then there were the more serious rules. Contact with the outside world was heavily restricted. Men were not allowed inside the convent, and nuns were not allowed to leave without permission. Windows were often covered or barred. Visitors were limited and monitored. The idea was to create a sealed environment, one where distraction, temptation, and influence from the outside could not interfere. But again, that was the ideal. In reality, enforcement depended on people. Some abbesses, the women in charge, were strict and uncompromising. They enforced discipline carefully, watching for any sign of disobedience. In those nunneries, the rules held stronger, but in others, authority was more relaxed, inconsistent, or even compromised. And that's where things began to slip. Because rules only work when they are consistently enforced. The moment oversight weakens even slightly, people notice. Boundaries become flexible. Expectations soften. And once one rule is bent, it becomes easier to bend another. At first, it's small. A conversation that lasts too long. a door left slightly open, a task done less carefully than required. But over time, those small shifts build into something larger. The structure remains on the surface, but underneath it begins to loosen, and that's when the real problem starts, because the stricter the rules, the stronger the reaction when they're broken. A system designed for total control leaves very little room for human nature, and when that nature pushes back, it doesn't always do so quietly. It finds ways around the rules, through them, sometimes even directly against them. So while the church built nunneries to eliminate disorder, something unexpected happened. The more tightly everything was controlled, the more pressure began to build inside. By now the pattern is clear. Women placed into a controlled environment, strict rules meant to suppress behavior, and authority that wasn't always perfect. That combination doesn't eliminate problems. It hides them, because silence, as it turns out, is very good at covering things up. Inside many nunneries, especially the larger or wealthier ones, daily life continued exactly as expected on the surface. Prayers were said, duties were performed, order was maintained. To any outsider, visitors, inspectors, or church officials, it all appeared stable, disciplined, and pure. But that depended on what you were allowed to see. Behind that structure, small secrets began to form, not necessarily dramatic at first. Private conversations held in corners, friendships that became unusually close, moments of emotional dependence that went beyond what the rules allowed. In a life defined by isolation, even basic connection could take on a deeper meaning, and over time those connections became harder to control. Some nunneries developed tight internal circles, groups of women who trusted each other more than they trusted authority. Within these circles, rules were quietly ignored, silence was broken, information was shared and sometimes hidden. What mattered wasn't just obedience anymore, but loyalty to one another. That's how secrets survive. Not through chaos, but through cooperation. And sometimes those secrets involved more than just conversation. There are historical accounts, scattered, debated, but persistent, of relationships forming that went beyond what the church considered acceptable. Emotional bonds turning physical. Attachments forming that challenged the entire idea of a life devoted solely to spiritual purity. These were not always widespread, but they were real enough to concern church authorities whenever they came to light. And when they did come to light, they caused problems, because the image of the nunnery was supposed to be controlled, disciplined, untouched by the kinds of behaviors found outside its walls. Any deviation from that image threatened not just the individuals involved, but the reputation of the institution itself. So what happened? In many cases, the response wasn't public exposure, it was quiet correction. Problems were handled internally. Individuals were separated, reassigned, or disciplined without drawing attention. Records were minimal. Details were often left out or softened. The goal wasn't to create scandal, it was to prevent it, which meant that for every incident we know about, there were likely others that never left the walls at all. And that's the key detail. The silence wasn't just part of the routine, it was part of the system. Up to this point, the system made one assumption, that nunneries were closed worlds, separated from men entirely. But that assumption didn't always hold, because despite the rules, men still found ways inside. Not openly, not officially, but through cracks in the system. Priests, for example, were allowed access for religious duties, confession, mass, spiritual guidance. These required male clergy to enter or at least interact closely with the nuns. And while most of these interactions were proper, they also created opportunities that in some cases were abused. There are documented instances where relationships formed between nuns and clergy, sometimes emotional, sometimes physical. The power dynamic made it even more complicated. A priest was not just a visitor, he was a figure of authority, someone trusted, someone whose presence was justified, and that made boundaries easier to blur. But clergy weren't the only ones. Servants, workers, messengers, people responsible for maintaining the convent's daily operations, could also come into contact with the nuns. Deliveries had to be made, repairs had to be done, food had to be brought in. The idea of total isolation was never perfectly realistic, especially in larger institutions, and where there is access there is risk. Some accounts describe secret meetings arranged carefully over time. Others suggest that certain nunneries developed reputations for being less strict, more vulnerable to outside influence. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories spread quickly. And once they did, they shaped how people viewed these places, not as untouchable sanctuaries, but as environments where control could fail. And when it failed, it created the kind of scandal the church feared most. Because this wasn't just about breaking rules, it challenged the very purpose of the institution. Nunneries were meant to represent purity, separation, devotion. Any involvement with men directly contradicted that image, turning private behavior into public contradiction. So when such cases were discovered, the response was swift and quiet. Individuals could be removed, transferred, or disciplined. In more serious cases, entire communities could be investigated or restructured. But again, the emphasis was rarely on public exposure. It was on containment, keeping the situation from spreading, because once a single case became widely known, it didn't stay isolated. It raised questions. It invited scrutiny. It suggested that what happened in one place might be happening in others, and that was far more dangerous than any individual incident. So the walls remained, but now it was clear. They were not as impenetrable as they seemed. By the time a scandal was discovered inside a nunnery, the situation had already gone too far to ignore. Rules had been broken, boundaries crossed, and now something had to be done. But here's the part most people never saw. Punishment in medieval nunneries was rarely public. Unlike crimes in towns or cities, where justice could be visible, even brutal, what happened inside convent walls stayed there. The church had no interest in turning these incidents into public spectacles. Exposure didn't solve the problem, it made it worse. So discipline became quiet, controlled, and often invisible. The severity depended on the offence. Minor rule breaking, talking during silence, neglecting duties, disobedience, might result in extra labour, reduced food, or enforced isolation. These punishments were meant to correct behaviour, to bring the individual back into alignment with the structure. But more serious violations were treated very differently. If a nun was found to have formed inappropriate relationships, especially physical ones, the consequences could be harsh. She might be confined to a cell, separated completely from the rest of the community. Communication would be restricted. Her daily life reduced to strict routine with little to no interaction. In some cases, this isolation could last for months, even years. And then there were the extreme responses. A nun could be transferred to another convent, removed from her environment, her connections, her support system. This wasn't just punishment. It was erasure, a way to reset the situation without leaving a trace behind. In rare and more severe cases, there are accounts suggesting even stricter confinement, though the exact details are often unclear due to limited records. Which brings us to the most important point. We don't know everything. Many punishments were never recorded in detail. Official documents tend to be vague, carefully worded, or completely silent on specific incidents. What we do know comes from scattered reports, occasional investigations, and the rare case where something went too far to be ignored. And even then, the full truth is difficult to recover. Because the goal was never transparency, it was control. Control of behavior, control of reputation, control of information. So while the outside world imagined nunneries as peaceful, orderly places, there was another layer beneath that image, a system of discipline that operated quietly, away from public view, designed not just to enforce rules, but to keep the illusion intact. By now it's clear that nunneries were not just spiritual spaces. They were controlled environments filled with rules, secrets, and quiet discipline. But there's another layer that made everything even more complicated: power. Because many nunneries were not poor, isolated places, some were wealthy institutions, controlling land, resources, and influence. Donations from noble families, income from estates, and support from the church could make certain convents surprisingly powerful, and where there is wealth, there is always risk of corruption. At the center of this power stood the abbess, the woman in charge. In theory, she was responsible for maintaining discipline, guiding the spiritual life of the community, and ensuring that rules were followed. But in practice, her role could be far more political. Some abbesses ruled strictly, maintaining order and structure with little deviation, but others used their position differently. There are accounts of abbesses favoring certain nuns, creating inner circles where rules were more flexible. Access to better food, lighter duties, or more freedom could be granted, not based on discipline, but on loyalty or status. In these cases, the convent began to resemble something less like a spiritual community and more like a small court, and courts come with intrigue. Conflicts developed, alliances formed. Disagreements over authority, resources, or personal influence could divide a nunnery from within. What was supposed to be a place of unity became, in some instances, a place of quiet competition. And then there was money. Managing land and resources required oversight, and not all abbesses handled it honestly. There are records suggesting misuse of funds, poor management, or even deliberate corruption. When wealth was involved, the line between spiritual leadership and personal gain could blur. And once that line blurred, everything else became easier to ignore. Rules about discipline softened, oversight weakened. Behavior that would have been punished elsewhere might be overlooked if it involved the right individuals. The structure didn't disappear, but it became uneven, applied differently depending on who you were and where you stood, which created a dangerous imbalance, because once people realized that rules could be bent, they began to test them further. The authority that held everything together started to lose its consistency, and without consistency, control becomes fragile. This is where many of the most serious scandals began, not in total chaos, but in environments where power was uneven, rules were flexible, and accountability was selective. Because a system built on discipline can survive pressure, but once power itself becomes unstable, everything inside it starts to shift. For a long time, everything we've talked about, rule breaking, hidden relationships, internal punishment, even corruption, remained contained within the walls. That was the goal. Silence protected the institution, but sometimes silence failed. And when it did, the consequences spread far beyond the nunnery itself. Scandals usually reached the outside world in one of three ways. First, through whistleblowers, individuals inside or connected to the convent who chose or were forced to speak. Second, through official investigations, often triggered by complaints or rumors that became too persistent to ignore. And third, through sheer exposure, when behavior became so visible that it could no longer be hidden. Once that happened, the church had a problem, because now it wasn't just about discipline, it was about reputation. Nunneries were supposed to represent purity, devotion, and moral authority. Any public scandal directly challenged that image, raising uncomfortable questions not just about one convent, but about the system as a whole. If something like this could happen in one place, where else might it be happening? And that question was dangerous, so the response had to be controlled but also decisive. Investigators, often church officials, would be sent to examine the situation. They would question the abbess, the nuns, sometimes even people from outside the convent. Reports would be written but carefully. Language was often vague, conclusions measured. The goal was to address the issue without amplifying it. Then came the corrections. In some cases, leadership was replaced. An abbess might be removed and a stricter authority installed. Rules would be reinforced, routines tightened, oversight increased. The nunnery would be reshaped, quietly, into something more controlled. In more severe situations, individual nuns could be expelled or transferred. Entire communities could be reorganized. And occasionally, a convent's reputation would be permanently damaged, becoming known, at least locally, for scandal rather than sanctity. But even then, the church rarely allowed the full story to spread. Details were limited. Records were controlled. What reached the wider public was often incomplete, softened or reframed, enough to show that action had been taken, but not enough to expose the full extent of the problem. Because once a scandal becomes widely known, it's no longer just an incident. It becomes a narrative, and the church understood something very clearly. Controlling that narrative was just as important as controlling what happened inside the walls. By now, the image of the medieval nunnery has shifted completely. What once seemed like a place of quiet purity now appears far more complex, filled with rules, pressure, power struggles, and at times, scandal. But before drawing conclusions, there's one final piece to understand. Not every story you've heard is true. Over the centuries, nunneries became easy targets for exaggeration. Writers, critics, and even political rivals of the church often amplified or distorted real incidents to create more dramatic narratives. A single case of misconduct could be retold as something widespread. A rumor could evolve into evidence, and once those stories spread, they were difficult to separate from reality, because scandal sells, and the idea of hidden corruption behind sacred walls was too powerful to ignore. At the same time, the church's tendency to keep things quiet didn't help. When information is limited, people fill the gaps themselves. Silence creates suspicion, and suspicion grows into stories, some grounded in truth, others driven by imagination. So what was really happening inside these nunneries? The answer sits somewhere in between. Most convents were not chaotic or corrupt. Many functioned exactly as intended, places of discipline, routine, and genuine devotion. For countless women, this life provided stability, education, and even a level of independence that was difficult to find elsewhere in medieval society. But that doesn't mean the system was perfect. There were cracks. There were cases of misconduct, hidden relationships, misuse of power, and internal conflict. These weren't constant or universal, but they were real enough to leave a trace in historical records, and strong enough to shape how people viewed these institutions over time. So the truth is not one extreme or the other. Nunneries were neither purely sacred sanctuaries nor secret centers of constant scandal. They were human environments, shaped by the people inside them. And like any place where strict rules meet real human emotion, they produced a mix of discipline and deviation, order and resistance, silence and secrets. And that's what makes them so fascinating, because behind the stone walls and daily prayers, there wasn't just one story being lived. There were many, some quiet, some hidden, some exaggerated, and a few that were never meant to be told at all.